Why did silence weigh heavier than the gunfire she once faced? Sarah Martinez sat at the edge of her bunk, the faint hum of fluorescent lights above her making the room feel colder than it already was. She had learned in Afghanistan that silence carried its own kind of violence, the silence of Marines who looked away, who muttered behind her back, who chose not to see her as one of them. But long before the scars, before the whispers, before the hospital corridors where she walked alone, there had been a girl with a dream. That girl had grown up in a dusty Texas town where mornings smelled of cattle feed, and the evenings were filled with her grandfather's stories. He was a man carved out of old wars, lines in his face like battle maps, his medals worn smooth from years of polishing. Sarah remembered sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at the shine of those medals, listening to him talk about brotherhood, about what it meant to stand for someone else when they couldn't stand for themselves. It was that memory she carried the day she walked into the Marine Corps recruiting office, her voice steady despite the nerves pressing at her chest. The sergeant behind the desk had looked at her like he was trying to see past the soft voice and kind brown eyes. "You sure about this?" he'd asked. His tone was not dismissive, but careful, as though he knew the weight of what she was asking for. "I've worked ranch land in 100-degree heat," Sarah had replied. "Pulled calves in the middle of a snowstorm. Hard work doesn't scare me." She signed the papers. The girl with a whisper became a Marine with a number and a uniform. Boot camp stripped her bare. It wasn't just the screaming, the exhaustion, the endless miles run until her legs gave out. It was the way they dismantled every piece of her to rebuild her into something harder. For some, that breaking crushed them. For Sarah, it lit something inside. She didn't win the fastest times. She didn't break records. But there was one thing nobody could take from her. She never quit. The other recruits noticed. So did the drill instructors, though they never said it out loud. In the Marines, respect wasn't handed out in words. It was in the nod, the silent glance, the absence of being singled out. She graduated middle of her class, not the best, not the worst, but someone who endured, and sometimes endurance was the only thing that mattered. Camp Pendleton became her new world. Rolling hills, the endless noise of training, the smell of sweat and oil clinging to the air. Sarah was assigned to logistics, hardly the battlefield she had pictured when she dreamed of service, but she threw herself into it. Forklifts, supply runs, manifests, convoys. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Combat units lived or died on supplies, and she knew it. Some Marines saw that, others didn't. Corporal Jenkins was one of the latter. His voice carried a sneer whenever she walked by. "This ain't no place for dress-up," he'd mutter just loud enough. "Real Marines don't need special treatment." Sarah learned early not to fight back. Not with words anyway. She showed up early, stayed late, took the worst shifts without complaint. Respect was earned not through arguing but through standing longer than anyone else was willing to. Slowly, most of her unit noticed. Jenkins never did. Some men don't. 6 months later, Afghanistan called. The forward operating base was nothing but dust and concrete barriers, a strip of razor wire under an unforgiving sun. Sarah learned that war wasn't just bullets and blood. It was paperwork, convoys, the endless demand for things always running out. 12-hour days turned to 14. Nights bled into mornings. Supply requests never stopped. And yet she discovered something. She was good at this. Better than she realized. She could see the bigger picture. How a shipment here meant lives saved there. How a delay in fuel meant a mission cut short. Still, Jenkins kept his shadow over her. A missed chance at praise here, an insult disguised as a joke there. The harassment was subtle, constant, like sand wearing down stone. But then the night came. It started with the sirens, a low, rising wail cutting through the base, slicing through the desert air. Sarah had been finishing reports when the walls shook from the first explosion. Dust rained from the ceiling. The loudspeakers barked, "Incoming, incoming, defensive positions." Her heart raced, but her hands didn't shake as she grabbed her rifle and helmet. Outside, the world was chaos. Marines sprinting, weapons in hand. the night sky lit by tracer fire and rockets streaking from the hills. She reached her bunker. Jenkins was already there, his face grim. He glanced at her and muttered, "Try not to wet yourself when the real shooting starts." Sarah ignored him. She scanned the perimeter, eyes sharp. The crack of AK-47 split the night, the heavier thump of Marine machine guns firing back. She spotted movement, called out positions, fired when she had to. Her training wasn't theory anymore, it was survival. 3 hours the attack raged. The enemy pressed harder, wave after wave. Then came the truck. An old vehicle, reinforced with crude armor, barreling toward the main gate. The kind of suicide weapon designed to end everything in one blast. Snipers fired. Heavy guns roared. The truck kept coming. Sarah saw it, an opening in the armor, a weak spot. She didn't think, she moved. Jenkins shouted after her, but his voice was lost in the storm. Sarah grabbed an RPG, sprinted forward, dropped to one knee. The truck was less than 100 meters out. One shot, one chance. She pulled the trigger. The explosion ripped the night apart. The truck vanished in fire, shrapnel raining down. Sarah was thrown back, her body crashing into concrete, pain tearing through her as darkness swallowed her whole. When she woke, it was in fragments, faces over her, voices shouting, the cold sting of medical instruments, then blackness again. Germany, then Walter Reed, weeks blurred into months, surgeries, pain, bandages. The scar on her face ran from temple to jaw, a jagged reminder the mirror refused to hide. Her body bore wounds, but those healed with time. The scar, that never left. And neither did the whispers. Some Marines came to thank her, some even apologized. Jenkins himself had stood at her bedside once, quiet for the first time. "You saved lives," he said, not meeting her eyes. But not all were like him. Not everyone understood. Scarface, they called her in the hallways, damaged goods. She had saved them, yet some reduced her to the mark on her skin. And somehow, that hurt more than the shrapnel ever had. Nights grew heavy with questions. What if they were right? What if the Marine Corps wasn't a place for her anymore? She called her grandfather one night, her voice breaking as she admitted the fear. "What if I'm not strong enough anymore?" His answer was steady, like the metals she remembered shining under Sunday light. "Sarah, strength isn't about looking unscarred. It's about standing up when others don't. You already did that. Don't let their words break you now." She listened, she tried, but in the quiet, doubt still clawed at her. The scar stared back every morning, whispering the lies others had planted. And yet there was something she hadn't told them. Not Jenkins, not the Marines who laughed, not even the ones who pitied her. Something she held deep, like a secret ember waiting to burn again. Because Sarah Martinez hadn't given her last fight yet. Why did the laughter sting more than the pain of shrapnel tearing through her skin? Sarah had faced enemy fire, the concussive blast of an explosion that nearly ended her life. But nothing in Afghanistan prepared her for the sound of Marines joking behind her back as she limped through the hospital cafeteria. "Scarface," one of them whispered, loud enough to be heard. "Bet she tripped over her own boots." The table erupted in low chuckles. She kept walking, step by step, food tray in hand. Her scar burned hot even when the wound itself had long since healed. It wasn't the flesh that hurt anymore. It was the shame someone else tried to write into her story. That night she lay awake in her narrow hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. The machines hummed softly. Outside her door, nurses' shoes clicked down the corridor. Sarah turned her face into the pillow, pressing it hard to block the sound, but the words replayed. The laughter replayed, louder than any explosion. She thought about requesting a discharge, ending it all with the stroke of a pen. No more sideways glances, no more whispers, no more pretending that the uniform fit her the way it fit others. But then she remembered Afghanistan, the gate, the truck, the seconds that stretched like hours when she had aimed, knowing if she missed, dozens of Marines would die. She remembered Jenkins shouting at her to get back. She remembered the moment the rocket left her launcher, the way the fire consumed the vehicle, and the silence after, the silence where Marines still breathed because of her. Her grandfather's words returned, like a hand steadying her shoulder across miles. It's not about how they see you. It's about having the heart to stand when others fall. Sarah turned her face back toward the ceiling, her jaw tight. She wasn't ready to fall yet. The next morning began with physical therapy at 6 sharp. Lieutenant Thompson, her therapist, carried a clipboard and the kind of voice that left no room for excuses. "Again," he said as Sarah struggled to lift her arm above her shoulder. "Push it." The scar tissue pulled, her muscles screamed, sweat slid down her temple. "You want to get back to duty, then stop fighting me and fight yourself." She did, again and again, until her arm trembled and gave out. She collapsed back onto the padded bench, breathing hard, chest heaving like she'd just run a mile. Thompson studied her, his face unreadable. "Good," he finally muttered, making a note. "But good isn't enough. You want to wear that uniform again. Then you'd better find more." Sarah closed her eyes, the echo of his words mingling with the whispers of those who doubted her. Good isn't enough. Damaged goods. Later in the cafeteria, the whispers returned. She carried her tray to a corner table, choosing solitude rather than risk the stares. That's when Sergeant Rodriguez rolled up beside her, his crutches leaning against his chair. He had lost his leg to an IED, but his eyes carried no shame, only weariness. "You keep hiding in corners, Martinez. They'll keep thinking they broke you," he said, stabbing at his food with a fork. Sarah stiffened. "I'm not hiding." Rodriguez raised a brow. "Then why are you sitting here by yourself?" She didn't answer. He leaned closer, voice lower. "Don't let kids who never saw combat tell you who you are. You've done more than half of them ever will. They don't get to define you." Sarah nodded, but the words sank slowly, like stones into water. She wasn't ready to believe them yet. Days blurred into weeks. Therapy sessions carved out her mornings. Pain marked her progress more than numbers ever did. She forced her body to remember how to run, how to lift, how to hold a weapon again. At night, though, the doubts crept back. She could feel eyes on her scars, hear the whispered names. The cafeteria became a battlefield more unforgiving than Afghanistan had ever been. The breaking point came in a group therapy session. Marines sat in a circle, the air heavy with unspoken pain. Dr. Wells, the civilian psychologist, asked each of them to share. When Sarah's turn came, she began to describe that night. The sirens, the truck, the way she had known there was only one shot. Her voice trembled but held steady. Then a Marine across from her interrupted. "Mason, injured in a stateside training accident." He leaned back in his chair with a smirk. "Come on, Martinez. We all know you're just making yourself sound like some kind of hero. Real Marines don't brag about doing their job." A ripple of laughter followed, not loud but sharp enough to cut through the air like a blade. Sarah's throat tightened. She hadn't bragged. She hadn't asked for the word hero. She hadn't asked for the scar. The room blurred as heat pressed behind her eyes. She pushed back her chair and left before anyone could see the tears. That night she called her grandfather. The payphone was cold against her ear, the hallway dim. "Mija," his voice was warm even across the static. She broke then, words spilling. "I don't know if I belong here anymore, Grandpa. They look at me like I'm broken, like I'm less. What if they're right?" There was silence, not the cruel silence of the cafeteria, a heavy, thoughtful one. Then his voice came firm. "Sarah Martinez, I didn't raise you to give up because someone else can't see your worth. You stood when others fell. You saved lives. You've got Marine blood in your veins and no scar, inside or out, can take that from you. Hold your head high, Mija. Make them see what a Marine really looks like." Tears slid down Sarah's face, but they were different this time. They weren't the tears of shame. They were the tears of someone remembering why she had signed her name on that paper years ago. The next day she didn't sit in the corner of the cafeteria. She walked into the middle, tray in hand, and sat down at the first open table. Eyes flicked to her scar. Whispers rose. She looked back, steady, unflinching. The scar was hers, and she would no longer wear it like a mark of shame. Slowly things shifted, not the whispers, those never completely stopped, but her own reflection changed. She met other wounded Marines who carried scars of their own, Staff Sergeant Williams with his missing hand, Corporal Jackson with burns that twisted half her skin. They smiled, they laughed, they lived. "The way I see it," Jackson told her one afternoon, "we've already survived the worst. Everything else is just noise." Sarah held on to that sentence like armor. 3 months later, her doctors prepared her case for review. She would have to face a fitness for duty evaluation. The words alone carried weight. Pass, and she could continue as a Marine. Fail, and her career would end with a scar and a discharge. Colonel Martinez, the officer overseeing her case, had met with her in private. His voice was calm but blunt. "You've got heart, Lance Corporal. No one denies that, but the Corps has standards. Returning to active duty will mean proving you can meet them, not just physically, mentally. You'll face Marines who'll question you every step. You prepared for that?" Sarah looked him in the eye, her voice steady. "Sir, I've already faced the worst they can give. I'm ready." He studied her, then nodded. "Then let's get you ready for that test." From that day, her mornings belonged to Master Sergeant Davis, a man built like stone, with a voice that left no room for doubt. He specialized in training wounded Marines. "The test isn't about minimums," he told her, watching as she hung from the pull-up bar, her shoulders shaking. "It's about showing every single person watching that you're still a Marine. Some are waiting for you to fail. Don't give them what they want." She dropped from the bar after her 10th attempt, arms on fire. Sweat dripped down her chin, and yet she smiled. The journey wasn't finished. The real test was coming, and somewhere in the shadows of that hospital, Marines still whispered her name like an insult. They didn't know yet. They didn't understand. But they would, because Sarah Martinez hadn't come this far to fall silent. How much pain could a body endure before the mind broke first? Sarah asked herself this every morning as she gripped the cold steel of the pull-up bar. Her muscles trembled. Her scar burned as sweat trickled into it, but she refused to let go. Master Sergeant Davis stood below, arms crossed, eyes unyielding. He didn't shout like the drill instructors at Paris Island. He didn't need to. His silence was pressure enough. "Again," he finally said. Sarah pulled until her vision blurred. Her left shoulder screamed, the damaged muscles threatening to give out. She clenched her jaw, teeth grinding, and lifted herself once more over the bar. Her chin broke the plane. She dropped down, gasping. Davis checked his watch. 7, not bad, minimum's 3, but minimums don't silence doubters. Again tomorrow. Sarah leaned against the wall, chest heaving. Her arms shook uncontrollably, but her eyes held a fire she hadn't felt in months. "I, Master Sergeant." That fire had to burn every day, because the evaluation loomed closer with each sunrise, and the whispers in the hospital halls hadn't stopped. "Bet she won't even pass the run. She's holding on just for sympathy. Scars don't make a Marine." Sarah heard them all. She let them feed the fire. But at night, when the lights dimmed and the barracks quieted, doubt still crawled in. She lay in bed, staring at the scarred ceiling tiles, feeling the ache in her shoulder, the throb in her legs. What if the whispers were right? What if the board saw her as nothing but broken parts stitched together? In the mornings, she shoved the thoughts aside and ran. Rain, snow, cold wind cutting into her lungs, it didn't matter. She circled the track, counting breaths, pushing through cramps until her legs gave out. Sometimes she collapsed on the last lap, sprawled on the wet track, staring at the sky. One evening, as she dragged herself off the ground, another Marine jogged up beside her, Corporal Peterson. He had burns down one arm, his skin uneven and ridged. You always punish yourself this hard?" he asked, jogging in place beside her. Sarah wiped her forehead. "I don't have a choice." Peterson tilted his head. "Sure you do. Most people would have quit by now." She looked at him, then back at the track. "That's exactly why I won't." He grinned. "Fair enough. Mind if I run with you next time?" From then on, he joined her. His presence didn't erase the pain, but it lightened the weight. Together, they pushed through laps, sharing little more than silence and ragged breaths. And sometimes, silence was the best kind of company. Still, not all company was welcome. One morning, as Sarah entered the gym, a small group of younger Marines stood near the doorway. Their voices carried. $10 says she can't do 2 pull-ups. 20 she cries before the run's done. They laughed. Sarah stopped. Her eyes flicked toward them. She could have ignored it, but something in her chest hardened. She walked past without a word, stepped to the pull-up bar and began. 1, 2, 3, 4. She didn't stop until her arms shook violently and her breath came in gasps. 9, 10, 11. She dropped down, wiped the sweat from her face and glanced back at them. Not a word spoken, just silence. Sometimes silence was louder than shouting. But silence didn't erase fear. During one of her evaluations with Dr. Russell, the psychologist, she sat across from him in the sterile room. His pen tapped against his clipboard. "Nightmares?" he asked. "Sometimes." "Flashbacks?" She hesitated. "Sometimes." "Do you ever see the scar and remember?" Her hand instinctively rose to her face. She lowered it slowly. "Every day." "And how do you handle that?" Sarah swallowed hard. "I don't hide it." Russell studied her for a long moment, then scribbled something down. But later that night, in her bunk, she admitted to herself that hiding was exactly what she wanted some days. There were mornings she longed to stay in her room, to avoid the cafeteria, to avoid the stairs. But then she'd hear her grandfather's voice echoing, "Hold your head high, Mija." So she did, even when it hurt. Weeks bled into each other. The fitness test grew closer. Sarah lived in the gym and on the track, in therapy rooms and in silence. Her body grew stronger, but the whispers never fully died. Some Marines respected her, some doubted her, and some just waited. The day finally came. A cold Tuesday morning, November air biting at her skin. The track was damp from a night of rain. Marines gathered, some supportive, others curious, a few smirking like they'd come to watch a show. Sarah had been awake since 3. She paced in her room, reciting the steps in her head: pull-ups, sit-ups, run. Each had numbers, each had a standard. She walked out in her PT gear, her scar catching the gray morning light. Whispers rippled through the crowd. She ignored them. Davis stood nearby, clipboard in hand. He gave her a curt nod. No words of encouragement, just the test. The pull-up bar loomed. Sarah gripped it, her palms slick with cold sweat. The minimum was 3. She had promised herself 8. She wanted 10. She pulled 1, 2, 3. Her shoulder flared, but she kept going. 4, 5, 6. The crowd grew quiet. 7, 8, 9. Her arms trembled, but she clenched her teeth and forced one more. 10. She dropped down, chest heaving, sweat running down her temple. Silence, then a few scattered claps. The smirks faded. Sit-ups came next. She crushed them. Then the run. 3 miles. Her lungs burned, her legs cramped, but Peterson was waiting on the sidelines, shouting, "Don't you dare quit, Martinez." She didn't. She crossed the line under the required time, collapsing to her knees, chest pounding. Davis checked his clipboard. His voice was flat, but his eyes gave her more than words. "You passed." But Sarah knew the test wasn't over. The board still waited. The officers who would decide if she could return to active duty. They wouldn't care only about numbers. They would look at her scars. They would ask the questions that cut deeper than any wound. As she walked back to her room, muscles aching, lungs raw, she felt the weight of every step. Whispers followed, but different this time. Not mocking, Not cruel, just uncertain. And somewhere in that uncertainty, a question lingered. Would the board see her strength or just her scars? Why did the conference room feel colder than the battlefield? Sarah stood at the doorway, her dress blues pressed, her ribbons perfectly aligned, every detail sharp. Yet her palms sweated inside her white gloves, her heart pounding harder than it had during the firefight in Afghanistan. The long table stretched before her, 5 senior officers seated in silence, their faces unreadable, folders stacked neatly in front of them, each containing her record, her medical reports, her test scores. Everything about her life boiled down to papers. Lance Corporal Martinez, Colonel Martinez said, his voice steady but formal. This board has been convened to determine your fitness for continued military service. Please step forward. Her boots echoed against the polished floor as she crossed to the center of the room. She stood at attention, her scar catching the light. She felt their eyes linger on it. She didn't flinch. "Do you have an opening statement?" the colonel asked. Sarah's throat tightened, but her voice came steady. "Sir, I joined the Marine Corps to serve my country and to stand for something bigger than myself. My injuries haven't changed that. If anything, they've made me more determined. I know some people doubt whether wounded Marines can still serve. I'm here to prove that we can. My scars don't make me weak. They prove I was willing to stand when others could have fallen." A silence followed, not heavy, calculating. The questions began. The medical officer leaned forward. "Lance Corporal, your shoulder injury, how much range of motion have you regained?" "About 90%, sir." "And the remaining 10? "I worked through it." He scribbled something, not looking at her again. The combat veteran spoke next, his tone sharper. "You've been under fire, you've been injured. How do we know next time you won't freeze? Trauma leaves marks we can't see." Sarah inhaled slowly. "Sir, I didn't freeze then. I saw the truck, I moved. I trusted my training and I trusted my Marines. I'll do the same again." The personnel officer adjusted her glasses. "Your career advancement may be limited. Injuries sometimes restrict assignments. How do you see yourself progressing long-term?" Sarah met her gaze. "Ma'am, I believe my experiences make me a stronger leader. I know sacrifice. I know recovery. I can guide Marines through challenges because I've lived them. I don't see scars as limits. I see them as lessons." Then came the voice that cut deepest. The sergeant major, his tone low but heavy with skepticism. "You've been mocked, called names, faced Marines who see your scar as weakness. How will you handle that if you return to duty? Will you let it break you again?" The words struck like shrapnel. Sarah's jaw tightened. She thought of the cafeteria whispers, the cruel laughter in therapy, the nickname Scarface. She thought of her grandfather's words echoing in the lonely night. "Sergeant Major," she said firmly, "I've learned that some people will always judge. My job isn't to change their minds. It's to do my duty. Respect isn't earned by demanding it. It's earned by action, and I will continue to prove myself through action." The room fell silent again. She could feel their eyes on her, weighing her words, her presence, her scar. "Thank you, Lance Corporal. You may step outside," the colonel said. She saluted, pivoted sharply, and walked out. Her legs felt heavy. The door shut behind her, leaving her alone in the sterile hallway. Minutes dragged into hours. She tried to read. She tried to stretch. But every thought circled back to that room, to the eyes on her scar, to the questions that carried judgment deeper than any bullet wound. What if they said no? What if this was the end? Meanwhile, inside the room, voices rose and fell. The medical officer frowned over her file. "Her physical recovery is impressive, but long-term. There's risk of regression. We need to be careful." The personnel officer nodded. "We also must consider precedent. If we clear her, others will expect similar treatment. Are we prepared for that?" The combat veteran leaned forward. "Precedent isn't the issue. Performance is. She didn't freeze in combat. She stopped a truck bomb. That's more than many Marines can say. The sergeant major shook his head. But scars change things. The Corps is unforgiving. Marines follow leaders who look unbreakable. Does she project that? That was when the door opened. A general entered. General Patricia Hayes. She wore her stars with the ease of someone who had carried weight longer than most could imagine. The room shifted instantly, every officer rising to attention. "At ease," she said, her voice calm, commanding. The colonel cleared his throat. "General Hayes, we weren't expecting you." "I know," she replied. "That's the point." She sat, her eyes scanning the room, then the file on the table. "I've been following Lance Corporal Martinez's case." Her tone carried no question. "I also witnessed, firsthand, how some Marines here treat the wounded." The sergeant major shifted uncomfortably. General Hayes leaned forward, her gaze steady. "I've seen Marines mock her. I've seen them laugh at her scars. And I've seen how she responds, with dignity, with restraint, with the quiet strength we claim to value. She's shown more Marine Corps spirit in a cafeteria than some show on a battlefield." The room was silent. "She stopped a truck bomb," Hayes continued. "Not in theory, not on paper, in reality. She ran toward fire when others would have hesitated. That's what matters. And now you sit here debating whether scars make her less. Gentlemen, ladies, scars don't make a Marine weaker. They prove survival. They prove sacrifice." Her voice softened but carried steel. "If we reject her, what message do we send to every wounded warrior watching? That their service ends the moment their skin is no longer flawless. That courage has an expiration date." The combat veteran nodded slowly. "She proved herself. I support her return." The personnel officer hesitated. "But the Corps." "The Corps," Hayes cut in sharply, "needs Marines who know resilience, who show others that scars don't end a career. Martinez embodies that. That's who we need in uniform." The discussion shifted, arguments softened, the tide turned. Hours passed. Outside, Sarah sat with her hands clenched, her heartbeat loud in her ears. When the door finally opened, Colonel Martinez stepped out. "Lance Corporal," he said, "the board has reached a decision. Please come inside." Her boots echoed again as she entered. She stood tall, though her chest felt like it might collapse. Colonel Martinez's voice was steady. "After review of your service record, medical condition, and performance, this board finds you fit for continued service. You are cleared to return to active duty with no restrictions." Sarah's chest lifted with relief, breath rushing out like she'd been holding it for months. But the colonel wasn't finished. He turned slightly. "General Hayes has a matter to discuss with you." Sarah looked up, truly seeing her for the first time. The stars on her collar, the authority in her eyes. General Hayes stood, walking toward her. "Lance Corporal Martinez, you've impressed me, not just in combat but here, during recovery. I've seen how you've carried yourself under pressure others couldn't endure, and I want you to know I have a different assignment in mind for you." Sarah's breath caught. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't know whether to be afraid or honored. The general's voice softened, though it carried no less weight. "At ease, Marine. You're about to be given an opportunity that might change not just your career, but this Corps." Sarah swallowed hard, her scar pulling slightly as her jaw tightened. She had no idea what came next, but for the first time in months, she felt something stirring again. Hope. Why was it harder to face opportunity than danger? Sarah had stared down a truck bomb in Afghanistan, yet standing across from General Hayes, she felt her pulse thundering in her ears. The general's eyes carried authority but also something softer, something Sarah hadn't seen in months: recognition. "Lance Corporal," Hayes began, "I've been observing. Not just your fitness evaluation, not just your service record, but the way you've carried yourself here at Walter Reed." She paused, letting the words sink. "I've seen Marines laugh at you, mock your scars, dismiss your sacrifice. I've also seen you rise above it without bitterness, without theatrics. That tells me more about your strength than any test ever could." Sarah shifted slightly, still at attention. Her throat tightened, unsure what answer would even be appropriate. The general studied her for a long moment, then continued. "I've spent months conducting an unofficial review of how our wounded are treated. I don't like what I've found. Discrimination, harassment, cruelty. Too many Marines believe scars mean weakness. Too many think service ends when the body breaks." Her voice grew sharper, steel under velvet. "That stops now, and I want you to help me stop it." Sarah blinked, confusion mixing with disbelief. "Ma'am." General Hayes leaned forward, her presence filling the room. "I'm creating a program, an initiative to change the culture of this corps. We will advocate for wounded Marines, ensure their dignity, and educate others about what true strength looks like. I want you on my staff as a special advisor. You'll travel with me, speak to Marines, tell your story, not because you asked for it, but because it needs to be heard." The air seemed to vanish from the room. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs. She had fought to return to logistics, to prove she could still load crates, manage supplies, and blend back into a unit. Now she was being asked to stand at the front of rooms, to let her scar speak louder than she ever intended. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile. "Ma'am, why me? There are others, senior Marines, officers, people with more years, more rank." Hayes didn't hesitate. "Because you've lived it. You've carried the weight without surrendering to it. You know what it feels like to be doubted, to be whispered about, to be mocked. And you've endured without breaking. That's why." Sarah's chest rose and fell. Her scar tingled as if the skin itself was listening. What if I'm not strong enough?" she whispered. The general stepped closer. Her voice lowered, but every word carried gravity. "Strength isn't about looking unscarred, Marine. It's about standing after being knocked down. And you've done that every single day. Your scars tell a story this corps needs to hear." Sarah's breath caught. The thought of standing before hundreds of Marines, exposing her pain, reliving the night of the explosion again and again, it terrified her. But beneath the fear, something stirred. Purpose. She nodded slowly. "I'll do it, ma'am." General Hayes smiled faintly, extending her hand. "Outstanding, Lance Corporal. Welcome to my team." Their handshake felt heavier than any salute. It was not just a gesture, it was a vow. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation. Sarah remained at Walter Reed, but her days shifted from therapy and training to planning sessions with Hayes's staff. She worked with officers drafting policies, with counselors designing peer support networks, with educators shaping presentations. But the hardest part was personal. Hayes told her plainly, "You'll have to stand up in front of Marines and tell your story, again and again. You'll face skepticism, maybe even open hostility, but that's the only way to change minds." Sarah practiced late at night, packing her small room, speaking into the mirror. She recounted Afghanistan, the sirens, the truck bomb, the fire. She spoke of the scar, of the whispers, of the nights when she almost gave up. Each time her throat caught, tears threatened. Each time she pushed through. The first real test came sooner than expected. Hayes arranged for Sarah to speak to a small group of recovering Marines at Walter Reed. 50 men and women, some in wheelchairs, some with bandaged arms, others scarred in ways no uniform could hide. Sarah stood at the front, palms damp, heart hammering. The scar on her face seemed to burn under the fluorescent lights. She gripped the podium, her voice trembling at first. "I wasn't supposed to be here," she began. "At least that's what some Marines said. They called me weak, said women didn't belong. Even after Afghanistan, even after the night I stopped that truck, some still said I was less. And when I woke up in the hospital with this scar, they laughed, called me damaged goods. Scarface." Her voice caught, the memory sharp. She paused, breath shaking. "But here's the truth," she continued, stronger now. "Scars don't mean weakness. They mean survival. They mean sacrifice. They mean we've been tested and we're still standing. That's strength. Silence filled the room. Then slowly one Marine began to clap. Another followed. Soon the room thundered with applause, not out of pity but recognition. Afterward a young corporal approached her, his hand trembling slightly. Two of his fingers were gone. His eyes glistened. "Ma'am," he whispered, "I've been ashamed of my hand ever since the IED. You made me see, maybe it's not shame. Maybe it's proof I came back." Sarah's throat tightened. She clasped his shoulder. "It's proof you're still here, proof you stood and survived." That night alone in her room she cried. Not from pain, not from shame, but from something she hadn't felt in months: purpose. As weeks turned into months, Sarah's voice grew stronger. She traveled with Hayes to other bases. She stood before rooms full of Marines, some skeptical, some eager, some hardened by their own battles. She told her story, her voice steady now, her scar no longer something to hide but something to show. There were moments of resistance. At Camp Lejeune, a Marine shouted from the back of the room, "You're only here because of sympathy." Sarah paused, the room holding its breath. Then she answered calmly, "If sympathy kept me alive in Afghanistan, maybe you'd be right, but it didn't. I stopped a truck bomb. That wasn't sympathy. That was service. And that's why I'm standing here today." The room went silent. The Marine lowered his eyes. Hayes pulled her aside afterward, her tone softer. "That's why you're here. Not every Marine will change their mind. But every time you speak, someone sees differently. And that's how change begins." Sarah nodded, though she still felt the weight of every word spoken, every room entered, every eye on her scar. It was exhausting. Exposing her pain again and again took more strength than any fitness test. But each time a Marine came to her afterward, tears in their eyes, gratitude in their voices, she remembered why she endured it. One night after returning from a long trip, Sarah sat by her hospital window, staring out at the dark grounds of Walter Reed. The scar reflected faintly in the glass. She thought of the girl who once signed her name in a small Texas town, the recruit who endured boot camp, the Marine who ran toward a truck bomb, the patient mocked in the cafeteria. Now she was something else, not just a Marine proving herself, a Marine carrying others. Her grandfather's voice came back to her, steady as ever. "It's not about how they see you. It's about standing when others fall." Sarah whispered into the quiet room, her voice almost a vow. "I'll stand, for them, for me, for all of us." And somewhere deep inside she knew, the scar would never fade, but neither would the purpose it had carved into her. Why did every face she spoke to feel like a mirror? Sarah had traveled to 4 bases in 6 weeks, standing in front of hundreds of Marines. Every time she saw the same eyes, some skeptical, some curious, some wounded, hiding scars that weren't always visible. And every time when she told her story, she felt those eyes shift, just slightly but enough. The words weren't easy. Each retelling forced her back into the desert night, back into the sirens, back into the explosion that carved a permanent line across her face. It was like ripping a wound open again and again, never letting it fully heal. But she knew why she did it. Because in every crowd at least one Marine came up to her afterward, their voice quiet, their posture heavy with something unspoken, and said, "Thank you. You said what I couldn't." At Camp Pendleton, a young sergeant with prosthetic legs rolled up in his wheelchair after her speech. His voice trembled. "I've been hiding in my barracks, couldn't look at myself. You made me realize, maybe I don't need to hide anymore." Sarah gripped his hand. "You don't, you never did." Moments like that lit a fire in her chest. But fire burned both ways. It gave warmth and it consumed. The strange showed in the quiet hours. Late at night in hotel rooms or temporary quarters, Sarah sat staring at the walls, her mind replaying every laugh, every insult, every flash of the explosion. The scar seemed heavier some nights, as if it had weight beyond skin. She would press her fingers to it, whispering to herself, "Don't let it break you. Don't let it own you." But there were days it nearly did. On a trip to Quantico, She overheard two Marines leaving the auditorium after her talk. "Good speech, I guess," one muttered. "Still don't think I'd follow her into combat, not with that face." The other chuckled. "Yeah, inspiration's one thing, leading another." Sarah froze in the hallway, their voices searing. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. She wanted to storm after them, to shout, but she didn't. She just stood there, letting the sting burn through her chest. Later that night, she sat across from Hayes in the general's quarters. The older woman studied her carefully. "Something eating at you." Sarah hesitated. "Sometimes I wonder if this is worth it. I keep telling my story, keep reliving it, and still there are Marines who see only the scar, not the Marine behind it." Hayes leaned back, her eyes sharp but kind. "Martinez, you're not here to convince everyone. Some minds are concrete, set, unmovable, but others just need a crack. You create those cracks, and cracks are how light gets in." Sarah swallowed hard. "And what about me? How do I carry this over and over?" The general's voice softened. "By remembering you're not carrying it alone. Every Marine you reach is carrying part of it with you." Sarah nodded, but the weight didn't vanish. It just shifted. Months passed. The program grew. Hayes's initiative gained traction, spreading across bases built on Sarah's speeches, on the policies they drafted, on the stories collected from other wounded Marines. For the first time in decades, the Corps began talking openly about dignity and injury, about resilience beyond physical strength. But progress had enemies. At one base in North Carolina, Sarah was met with open resistance. A group of Marines in the audience smirked openly during her talk, whispering loud enough for others to hear. When she finished, one of them, a staff sergeant, stood. "With all due respect, ma'am," he said, his tone dripping sarcasm, "I don't need a scarred-up motivational speaker telling me what being a Marine means. We're warriors, not charity cases." The room went still. Dozens of eyes swung toward her. She felt the old sting, the urge to shrink, to walk off the stage. Instead, she steadied herself, her voice calm but unwavering. "You think scars make me less of a Marine?" she asked. He didn't answer, but his smirk said enough. Sarah stepped closer, her gaze never leaving his. "These scars came from running toward a truck bomb while others ran for cover. I didn't choose them, but I chose to stand. That's what makes a Marine, not unscarred skin, but the willingness to face fire. And if you can't see that, maybe it's not me who needs reminding of what a warrior is." The staff sergeant's smirk faltered. The room erupted in applause. Afterward, Hayes pulled her aside, her eyes glinting with pride. "That's the fight I saw in you the first day. Not bitterness, not rage, just truth." But Sarah felt the tremor in her hands long after. Every confrontation left echoes. The pressure mounted further when media outlets caught wind of the initiative. Articles appeared. Headlines: "Scarred Marine leads wounded warrior advocacy." Interviews followed. Cameras zoomed in on her scar. Some praised her courage. Others questioned whether the Corps was turning into a stage for sympathy. One night, Sarah scrolled through comments online. Some were supportive, calling her an inspiration. Others were cruel. "She just wants attention, not a real Marine. Probably got hurt by accident and milks it." Her chest tightened. She slammed the laptop shut, pressing her palms into her eyes until stars burst behind them. The next morning, Peterson found her in the gym, pounding through sit-ups with a ferocity that bordered on punishing. "You're going to break yourself," he muttered. "Better me than let them break me," she snapped. He crouched beside her, voice quiet. "Martinez, you don't have to prove it to the ones who'll never see. You've already proved it to the ones who matter." Sarah closed her eyes, sweat dripping down her face. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. One evening, she returned to Walter Reed after weeks on the road. The hospital felt almost like home again, its halls familiar. As she walked through the cafeteria, she noticed a new patient, barely 18, his arm gone, his face pale with fear. He sat alone, staring at the floor. Sarah took her tray and sat across from him without asking. He looked up, startled, eyes flicking to her scar. She saw the recognition, the fear of becoming her. "You see this?" she said, pointing to the scar. He nodded silently. "I used to hate it, thought it made me less. Now I see it for what it is, a reminder I stood when it mattered. Yours will be the same, you just don't see it yet." The boy's eyes welled, but he nodded again. "Thank you," he whispered. That night Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She realized then, the program wasn't just about speeches or policies. It was about moments like that. Sitting with someone who saw only loss and showing them it was something else, proof they had survived. But the weight remained, carrying the stories of others, of scars, of amputations, of burns, of trauma. It pressed on her chest. Some nights she cried quietly, pressing her face into the pillow so no one would hear. She wasn't breaking, but she was bending. Hayes noticed. "You can't carry them all alone," the general said one morning, catching her after a talk. "You need your own support, Martinez. Even the strongest walls crack if they take every blow." Sarah hesitated. "What if admitting that makes me weak?" Hayes's gaze softened. "Admitting you need strength isn't weakness. It's the truest form of courage." Sarah nodded, though the lesson was harder to live than to hear. One night, as she sat by her window overlooking the quiet grounds, she whispered to herself, "You're still here. You're still standing." But deep inside, another question lingered, haunting her in the silence. How long could she keep standing before the weight became too much? Why did applause sometimes sound like chains? Sarah stood on yet another stage, the echo of clapping hands filling the auditorium. Marines in uniform rose to their feet, some nodding in respect, others simply following the rhythm of the room. She smiled faintly, gave her final salute, and stepped down. Her chest was tight, her throat dry. She had told the story again, the sirens, the truck, the fire. Again she had bared her scar to strangers. Again she had carried the weight. And again, when the crowd dispersed, she was left with silence. Back in the green room, the silence pressed harder than the applause had. She sank onto a chair, elbows on her knees, face in her hands. The scar throbbed as if the memory lived in her skin, never letting her forget. How many times could she retell it before it consumed her? That night she called her grandfather. The phone rang 3 times before his voice came, rough with age but warm as always. "Mija." Her breath hitched. "Grandpa, I don't know if I can keep doing this. Every time I talk, I feel like I'm tearing the night open again. I see the fire, I feel the blast, and afterward I don't feel stronger, I just feel empty." There was silence on the other end. Not judgment, not impatience, just listening. Finally, he spoke. "Sarah, do you remember what I told you when you deployed? That being a Marine isn't about being the toughest. It's about having the heart to stand up when others fall." She closed her eyes, tears brimming. "But what if I can't stand anymore?" His voice grew firm. "Then you lean on me, on the ones who understand. No Marine fights alone, Mija, not on the battlefield and not in life." Sarah swallowed hard, nodding though he couldn't see. His words steadied her, but they didn't erase the ache. The next day, Hayes noticed. The general caught her after a meeting, her sharp eyes softening. "You're burning out," Hayes said quietly. Sarah tried to protest, but the general raised a hand. "Don't, I see it. You give and give, but you don't refill. That's not sustainable." Sarah lowered her gaze. "What if stepping back looks like weakness?" Hayes's tone carried steel. "Weakness is pretending you're invincible. Strength is knowing when to breathe. I need you in this fight for the long haul, not collapsing halfway through." For the first time, Sarah felt permission to rest. But rest didn't come easily. The breaking point arrived one night at a base in Texas. She had given a speech to a room full of Marines, her voice steady, her story polished. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, she overheard a group near the back. "Pretty speech," one said. Still don't buy it, scars like that. She's just a poster child. Yeah, another muttered, sympathy tour. Their laughter was quiet but sharp enough to pierce. Sarah froze. The words replayed in her head like shrapnel rattling in a wound. She excused herself quickly, her steps fast down the corridor, her breath shallow. She pushed into the nearest restroom and locked the stall. Her chest heaved, her hands shook. The scar burned like fire across her face. She pressed her palms to it, whispering, "Stop, stop. You're not broken, you're not." But the whispers of others drowned her own voice. Scarface, damaged goods, poster child. For the first time since Afghanistan, Sarah felt herself unraveling. Tears poured freely. Her breaths came ragged. She sank to the floor of the stall, pulling her knees to her chest. She had faced enemy fire, stopped a truck bomb, endured surgeries, stood before generals. And yet here, in a locked bathroom, she felt defeated. When she returned to her quarters that night, she found Peterson waiting. He had seen her slip away, had seen the cracks she tried to hide. He didn't ask questions. He just sat beside her on the bunk, silent. Finally, he said softly, "You don't have to carry it all, Martinez." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "If I don't, who will?" He looked at her, his own scarred arm catching the light. "We all carry parts, that's the point. You don't fight this alone." Sarah's tears slowed. She leaned back against the wall, exhausted, but the truth in his words settled deep. Maybe leaning wasn't failing. Maybe sharing the weight was the only way forward. The next morning she walked into the cafeteria and deliberately chose a table with others. Marines stared. Some whispered. She ignored them. She sat down, lifted her chin, and met their eyes. One of the younger Marines, a woman with burns across her hands, hesitated, then sat beside her. Sarah smiled faintly. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just enduring the whispers anymore. She was becoming a place others could lean. Weeks later, Hayes gathered her team. The general announced that the initiative would expand, officially becoming a corps-wide program. Sarah's speeches had ignited something larger. The stories, the policies, the culture, it was shifting. But Hayes looked directly at Sarah as she spoke. "This isn't just about the Corps. It's about people like Martinez who turned scars into strength, not just for themselves, but for everyone watching." Applause filled the room. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, but this time it didn't feel like chains. It felt like recognition. Still, later that night, she sat by her window, whispering into the quiet, "You're still standing, but don't forget you're allowed to lean." For the first time, she believed it. But one question lingered, deep in her chest. A question she couldn't shake, no matter how many claps or nods she received. When the applause faded, when the speeches ended, when the Corps moved on, who would she be then? Why did the quiet moments feel heavier than the loud ones? Sarah had stood in front of hundreds of Marines, faced down doubters, silenced cruel whispers with truth. Yet now, sitting alone at a desk in her small quarters, pen hovering above a blank page, she felt the weight more than ever. General Hayes had asked her to draft a final speech for the Corps' new Wounded Warrior program, a keynote address. It would be delivered at the Pentagon before leaders, officers, reporters, cameras. The nation would hear her. The Corps would hear her, and she didn't know if she was ready. She stared at the page. Words flickered through her mind, scar, strength, survival, but nothing settled. She pressed the pen down, then stopped, her hand trembling. What could she possibly say that hadn't already been spoken? Her scar itched as though reminding her, this isn't about perfect words, it's about truth. She set the pen aside, closed her eyes, and let memory speak. The memory began the same way it always did, with sirens, with fire, with the explosion that threw her into the dirt, tearing her open, remaking her forever. She remembered waking up in Germany, the sterile lights above her. She remembered the cafeteria whispers at Walter Reed, Scarface, damaged goods. She remembered the payphone, her grandfather's voice steady through the static. It's not about how they see you. It's about standing when others fall. She remembered running on broken legs, gasping through pain, proving herself on the track. She remembered the boardroom, the eyes on her scar, the moment General Hayes walked in and turned judgment into opportunity. She remembered the speeches, the doubt, the staff sergeant's sneer, the applause that followed. And she remembered the breaking point, the locked bathroom stall, tears falling harder than any wound bled. The moment she nearly gave up. The moment Peterson reminded her that no Marine carries the weight alone. Sarah opened her eyes, her throat tight. She didn't need to write something perfect. She just needed to speak what she had lived. The day of the keynote arrived cold and clear. The Pentagon auditorium filled quickly, rows of uniforms, rows of medals, rows of expectant faces. Cameras whirred, journalists scribbled, leaders leaned forward. Sarah stood backstage, her dress blues immaculate, the bronze star and purple heart catching the lights. Her scar caught them too, unhidden, unsoftened. She could feel eyes waiting for it, waiting to define her by it. Hayes stood beside her, calm as always. "Nervous?" she asked. Sarah gave a tight smile. "Always." The general's eyes softened. "Good, nerves mean you care. Now go show them why." When Sarah stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Not hostile, not mocking, just waiting. She gripped the podium, took a breath, and began. "I used to think scars were shameful," she said. "I used to think they marked the end of who I was. When I woke up in a hospital bed, my face torn open, I believed I'd lost the right to wear this uniform. Because some Marines told me so. They called me names. They whispered behind my back, and I let those whispers sink into me like shrapnel." Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop. "But here's what I learned. Scars don't end us, they remind us. They remind us of nights we survived, of battles we stood through, of lives we saved when we thought we couldn't. Scars don't mean weakness. They mean we were tested, and we're still here." The room was still. No scribbling, no whispers. "I know some of you doubt me. Some of you doubt anyone who carries scars. I've heard the whispers. I've seen the stares. But let me tell you this. I did not stop being a Marine the night I was wounded. I became one. Because a Marine is not someone without wounds. A Marine is someone who stands, scarred or not, when others can't." She paused, her scar catching the light. "And if you want to know what a real Marine looks like, look at every scar in this room. They are not shame. They are not pity. They are proof." Silence stretched. Then applause began, slow, growing, until the room roared with it. Not sympathy, not charity, recognition. Sarah stood straighter, letting the sound wash over her. But deep down, she knew the applause wasn't the point. What mattered was what came after, how each Marine carried those words forward, how each scar was seen differently. That night after the speech, Sarah walked outside into the cold air. The stars stretched above the Pentagon like distant medals pinned to the sky. She breathed deep, her chest finally lighter. Peterson walked up beside her, hands in his pockets. "You killed it," he said with a grin. Sarah chuckled softly. "I didn't kill anything, I just told the truth." "And sometimes," he replied, "that's the hardest mission." She nodded. He was right. Truth was its own battlefield. Months passed. The program grew beyond anything Sarah had imagined. Bases across the world adopted new policies. Wounded Marines were no longer hidden away but honored, their stories told, their scars respected. Change was slow, uneven, sometimes resisted, but it was real. Sarah herself advanced in rank. She led teams. She spoke less about her scar and more about others. She carried their stories forward, weaving them into a larger truth. But she never forgot the nights of silence. The bathroom floor, the payphone, the whispers, because those were the places strength had been born. Years later, she returned to her small Texas hometown. Her grandfather's medals still shone on the mantel, worn smooth from years of polishing. He was older now, slower, but his eyes glistened with pride when she walked through the door in uniform. "You stood, Mija," he whispered, hugging her tightly, "just like I knew you would." Sarah smiled, her scar pressing into his shoulder. She no longer hid it, no longer flinched at mirrors. It was part of her, not her shame, not her end, her story. And when she stood one last time before a group of young recruits, nervous faces fresh in uniform, she told them this. Strength isn't silence. Strength isn't pretending you're unscarred. Strength is standing again and again, even when the world tells you to fall. Scars don't speak in words, they speak in presence. They speak in survival, they speak in dignity. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The room went silent. Then one recruit raised his chin higher, as though carrying her words like armor. Another straightened his shoulders, and Sarah knew her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to all of them. She stepped down from the podium, the scar on her face catching the light one last time, not as a wound, but as a banner. And in the quiet afterward she smiled. Not because the whispers had ended, but because they no longer mattered.